Hi, my name is Ronnie Fomia. I'm a pharmacist here in the state of Michigan. I've been practicing pharmacy since 1999 here in the state. I've seen the profession of pharmacy drastically change over the past 20 years or so. I am very passionate about this subject for many reasons. I truly believe that the opioid epidemic is man-made, that we created a lot of the problems that we face today. There's more people dying today of overdoses in general of drugs than ever before. In 2015, 52,000 people died of overdoses from drugs. That surpassed car accidents and it surpassed gun violence. How often do we hear about people that have suffered from gun violence or have gotten into a car accident and have lost their life? Overdoses in general, drug overdoses in general, have now surpassed that. That is a massive problem here in the United States and in Michigan. The whole purpose of my lecture is really to give an overview, to get a better understanding of what is happening with this epidemic. Not only that, for patients looking to get help, for people that are afflicted by this, for family and friends that want more information. This is a quick summary of what is happening, how we got to this point, and hopefully to get a better understanding so that you can become more compassionate to help these individuals get healthy. Here's another shocking truth. 75 to 80%, and this is why I'm so passionate about this, is 75 to 80% of people that are addicted to heroin at one point abused prescription drug painkillers. That is a truth, a fact that we cannot ignore. Further, the amount of people that have died of opioid overdoses from 1999 to 2015 has quadrupled. During that same time period, this will blow you away, during that same time period, prescriptions for prescription painkillers has also quadrupled. We cannot ignore that point. So I'm hoping that this lecture gives you a good understanding of where we are and hopefully where we can go going forward, but it'll give you a much better understanding of the challenges that we faced and how we got here. So let's talk a little bit about what are opioid drugs. Opioids all act in the brain in the same way. I will talk about a little bit about how they change brain chemistry and why it's so hard for people to get off these drugs once they get hooked. It literally is changing the brains of these individuals. All of these drugs are central nervous system depressants, meaning that they slow down brain signals and so forth, but they also may slow down breathing, which I'll talk about why that's so important in a little bit. Opioids attach to specific receptors, which are found in the brain and throughout the central nervous system. They actually slow down the brain from sending out pain signals, and that's why they're so great at pain drugs. The problem is that they also can cause ecstasy and euphoria, a feeling of well-being. They can make people feel relaxed. People love that. The brain gets used to that. That remembers that feeling and it wants more and more and more as we go. Let's quickly define the difference between the term opiates and opioids. Opiates was an older term that was used for drugs that were from the natural version of these drugs that would derive from the plant, the opium poppy plant, such as morphine and codeine. The synthetic versions of these drugs that are derived from a lab were referred to as opioids. In today's world, that term opioids encompasses the general term of all opiates and opioids. So the opioids term refers to today's world, the natural and the synthetic versions. But you might see both terms used, so just for your understanding of what that is. Here's that plant that I was talking about, the opium poppy plant. Huge production of this is made in Mexico. The seed is planted, and over a course of about 3 months or so, it grows through this beautiful looking flower. And in that bulb right there, it is cut and the drug is actually extracted from that bulb. And this is the main area where we get the natural version of these drugs. And then this is the root cause. This is where heroin is produced from as it's changed, which we'll talk about. These drugs attach to different receptors throughout the central nervous system, in the brain and in the spinal cord. And then when they attach to those receptors, these opioid receptors that are found in the brain and in the spinal cord, they set off a series of reactions. And this is the problem that we face because of the fact that over time, when these people take these drugs, they actually change these receptors. There's a change in brain chemistry. That is why it is so hard for these people to get off these drugs. These drugs are similar, opioid drugs are similar to the naturally occurring endorphins that we have in our body. So when the difference though between the naturally occurring endorphins and opioids is that they're much stronger. When opioids attach to the receptor, they cause a much stronger feeling of euphoria and ecstasy. Endorphins can cause a decrease of brain signals so that there's a pain slowing down in essence. But the differences between them and endorphins and opioids is the fact that the opioids attach to the receptor and it's much stronger. And it's the overall chemical reaction is much more powerful. So in essence, endorphins naturally also block pain. They also give us that runner's high, but the opioids are a whole different level, a whole different ballgame because of the fact that they're so much stronger and the release of chemicals and neurotransmitters in our brain is much stronger. Opioids also are found in the part of the brain that releases dopamine, another type of neurotransmitter. And our brain remembers this pleasure feeling, the ecstasy feeling. And over time, those receptors, when the opioids attach to them, it'll want more and more and more of that feeling to maintain that same level. And the opioids, again, cause a flooding of these neurotransmitters versus the naturally occurring endorphins. So here's the problem. The main problem that people don't realize is that when these drugs attached to those receptors in the brain, those are the same type of receptors that also regulate breathing. So why is that important? When these people take too many of these type of drugs, they flood these receptors. Or if the drug is too potent, they flood the receptors and it slows down breathing or it shuts off breathing altogether. Within 3 to 5 minutes, these people's brains start to die and it sets off a cascade of events that lead to death. People don't realize that is the main pathway that death occurs with opioid overdoses. And it's a fact that we can't ignore. There's things that we can do to better understand that. Understanding that point will lead to why it is so important to have education around you of what you can do to help protect these individuals. That part that I talked about with changing chemistry, I truly believe that opioid addiction is unlike any other chronic illness because of the fact that it changes those receptors in the brain. Just like diabetes, just like hypertension, I view the opioid addicted individuals as a chronic illness. And it takes time, it takes effort, it takes a lot of support to help get these people healthy. But we can learn from that. We can hopefully learn from this talk about what we can do going forward to be more compassionate and understanding around these individuals. Because of the fact that it may sound simple to you or I about why don't people just quit, but the problem is that the brain has actually changed. It needs these drugs, and I'll explain that in just a little bit. So there's different types of opioids. There's naturally occurring opioids from that plant that I showed you, from that they extract morphine and codeine after they cut that a bulb of the opium poppy plant. There's semi-synthetic drugs such as oxycodone. Oxycodone is known as OxyContin in an extended release version, and hydrocodone, probably the most common painkiller that is prescribed in brand names of like Norco and Vicodin. There's semi-synthetic drugs such as fentanyl. Fentanyl is a drug mostly used in cancer patients in a patch form called Duragesic, but it can also come in different forms as well. Another form is called Actique, which is an actual lozenge. Then you have the other synthetic version, the illicit version. Now, synthetic versions mean, remember, they're primarily made in a drug lab somewhere. And that's the difference between the naturally occurring that come from the plant. These are made in a lab. Heroin is an illicit drug. It's illegally made in a lab from the conversion of morphine. It is extracted, it is taken to drug labs, and then through a series of chemical reactions, it is turned into heroin. The difference between heroin and morphine, it's again chemically very similar, but it's much, much more potent. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. That example I gave you, that 75 to 80% of people that are addicted to opioids, that are addicted to heroin, at one point abuse prescription drugs. That is a shocking truth. That is a fact that we cannot ignore. This is why I truly believe that the opioid epidemic is a direct link with our prescribing habits. Over a series of the past 20 years, I saw it, I've witnessed it, and it is one of these things that I've saw evolve. 75 to 80% of people that are addicted to heroin at one point abuse prescription drugs. So some of the examples that are very common in the marketplace, Tylenol 3 or Tylenol 4, it's just Tylenol mixed with codeine. We have hydrocodone, probably the most common painkiller prescribed in Norco and Vicodin. Fentanyl, I talked about. Hydromorphone, which is known as Dilaudid. Meperidine, which is Demerol, an older opioid drug. Methadone is used for pain because it's a very actually good pain drug because it's a long-acting opioid, but it's also used in methadone clinics. Morphine, is known as MS Contin and an extended release version, but it also comes in different versions as well. Oxycodone we talked about, and there's a history with oxycodone that I'll talk about in just a little bit as well. The extended release version is known as OxyContin, and the oxycodone also comes in immediate release versions. But these are some of the more common ones on the market. Now remember, 75 to 80%, we cannot forget that. So there's a link to this, Prescribing and Heroin Use, and then we'll get more into that. Certain side effects of these drugs: they can cause constipation, they can cause the pupils to constrict, they can cause upset stomach, nausea, vomiting, they can cause dizziness, confusion, they can cause people to feel depressed. Long-term use, low levels of testosterone can lead to decreased libido, they can cause itching and sweating. And then that overdose situation that I mentioned, that they can lead to respiratory depression. That is a key fact that we cannot ignore. These people actually die because they stop breathing if they take these drugs in excess. Here's the key thing with that brain chemistry change. Over time, we develop tolerance, meaning this: when those drugs attach to those receptors that I was talking about, over time those receptors change. They actually change in the brain, they change in the spinal cord, that you'll need more and more of that feeling, more and more of the drug and higher doses or higher potency to get the same effect. And that is where these people go down that slippery slope of doing crazy things to try to obtain these drugs, because of the fact that they feel they have no choice to remain healthy. Your brain that's the new normal. So when you actually take away these drugs, your brain says, what's happening? It goes into a shock and you go a series of withdrawal. You're physically dependent on these drugs. If you remove the drugs, because that is your new normal, you actually go through shock symptoms. This video is going to be eye-opening. I want to show you this quick video. It's a 1.5 minute video that shows you what happens when people actually go through an opioid overdose. People don't realize, when I ask people, so how do people die? There's a lack of understanding around this process.
Let's begin with understanding what an opioid overdose is and how it affects the body. Opioids work by interacting with receptors in our brain. The opioids fit into these receptor sites, sort of like a key fits in a lock. What makes opioids potentially so dangerous is that these same receptors ensure we keep breathing. An overdose happens when more and more opioid molecules latch onto these receptors, overwhelming the brain's ability to keep us breathing properly or even at all. Because someone suffering from an opioid overdose may appear to be simply sleeping, it's important to know the signs to look for. Specifically, breathing becomes very slow and shallow, erratic, or has stopped. Snoring or gurgling sounds are made. Pupils become pinpoints. There is a loss of consciousness. The person is unresponsive to outside stimulus. The body is limp. Pulse is slow, erratic, or not there at all. The face is pale and clammy. Fingers and lips turn blue or purple, and the person may also experience vomiting. An opioid overdose deprives the body of oxygen, which can cause vital organs, especially the brain, to shut down. After 3 to 5 minutes without oxygen, brain damage starts to occur, soon followed by death. Fortunately, there is a medication that can temporarily combat opioid overdose symptoms, buying critical time for paramedics to arrive. Naloxone is a competitive antagonist to opioids. It works by knocking the opioids off the brain receptors they've latched onto, allowing the person to breathe again, and temporarily reverses the overdose.
Hopefully that video gave you a better understanding of what happens during an opioid overdose situation. People actually stop breathing, oxygen stops going to the brain, and it becomes literally a life and death situation within minutes, because our brain can't go that long without receiving oxygen. After the brain starts to die in 3 to 5 minutes, it sets off a cascade of reactions that lead to death. And it is a horrible way to die. But we can do something about this, and I'll explain to that. I'm hoping that gave you a better understanding. So how did we get to this point? Just a quick overview. Pain was historically 15 years ago, 20 years ago, was being viewed as a fifth vital sign by different healthcare facilities, that at no matter what cost, that they were going to treat the pain without looking at other alternatives. Patients were leaving these facilities, whether it be hospitals or whatever, and rating the hospital on their overall stay. And over time, the culture became, we have to make sure we treat their pain. We have to do whatever it takes to make them comfortable, as we want to make sure that our ratings in our hospital or whatever clinical setting it is remain as high as possible. That was one of the culture changes that really changed and shifted the way we viewed prescribing habits. over time, manufacturers, there's been several manufacturers over the course of the past 20 years that have really pushed a lot of these pain drugs to get them out into the market. There's been a lot of lack of information. There's been a lot of lawsuits toward these manufacturers as well because of the fact that they were advertising, that they were pushing these drugs as safe for long-term use with little chance of addiction. And guess what we know today? That is not the case. That also started to drive up. 20 years ago, the amount of Vicodin ES, which is no longer in the market, which had 750 milligrams of acetaminophen mixed with hydrocodone, it was given out like you wouldn't believe. I saw the evolution of this epidemic literally 20 years ago. The culture was there that we're just going to throw out these drugs, and that's where it began. Literally 20 years ago, we saw the huge influx of these drugs hitting the market. But again, that culture with the clinical settings, the culture of the drug manufacturers, and then also that link then we saw to prescription painkillers. Heroin, 75 to 80%, I've said it 3-4 times now, had started at one point abusing prescription drugs. The lack of education around prescribers. I don't think that prescribers that are giving out these prescriptions have been properly trained. That same time period that deaths from opioids has quadrupled from the year 2000 to 2015, that same time period, prescription opioids have also, the amount that was hitting the streets and giving to patients has also quadrupled. Availability of the prescription painkillers. There was a lot of laws that didn't match up to reality that has gotten much better. For example, 3-4 years ago, it was legal to give 5 refills on Vicodin. So doctors were writing for Vicodin with 5 refills without follow-up, without proper checkup. Guess what? Around 2014, all refills, a doctor could only write for an original prescription with no longer allowing refills on hydrocodone, which became a Schedule II controlled substance. Lack of education from patients. Patients were popping these pills left and right without educating themselves because of that culture that started 20 years ago. The huge mix of synthetic drugs, this is what's led to that huge incline over the past few years of people dying of these opioids because of the fact that heroin was being laced with a drug called fentanyl or carfentanil. Fentanyl, again, the illegal version that was made in the lab, it was being laced with heroin, and then also carfentanil, which is an elephant tranquilizer, not even used in humans. They're also combining that with heroin. What's happening is these people are injecting, and within minutes to seconds, they're going into an overdose situation because they stop breathing. We'll talk more about that in a bit. There's been a huge influx of these drugs from Mexico and China, and a combination with other drugs. I cannot tell you enough that how often I have seen over the years of these painkillers also prescribed with benzodiazepine type drugs such as Xanax and Valium. On top of that, they give a muscle relaxer such as Soma. We call that the Trinity effect in pharmacy practice because we look for that. We look for those warning signs. The more that these central nervous system drugs are combined with opioid drugs, the greater likelihood of someone overdosing. Same thing with alcohol. When these drugs are combined with alcohol, greater chance of overdose occurring. Also, not only do we see that Trinity effect, but we often see something else, that we'll often see those three drugs. On top of that, give cough syrup, such as promethazine with codeine. To me, that is irresponsible, and that's my point around the lack of education around proper and safe prescribing of these medications. The reality of today's world. How did we get to this point? I've talked a lot about that. Where are we today? That the majority of drug overdose deaths, more than 6 out of 10, 60% involve opioids. That's why this is such an emergency. This is why I'm so passionate about this subject. The number of overdose deaths involving opioids has quadrupled, as I mentioned, from 1999 to 2015, or 2000 to 2015. During that time period, more than 500,000 people have died from overall drug overdoses. 91 Americans die every day as of 2015, literally 2 years ago, with the most recent data that I've seen from opioid overdoses. And this number is even higher today. This doesn't even include the amount of people that are going to the emergency rooms that are being revived because of a drug called Naloxone that helps people revive. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the 15-year sharp increase is something that we have to acknowledge and understand. The amount of prescriptions, again, that have been written has quadrupled, but overall, pain has not been increased. The people aren't saying that there are more pain today, but the painkillers have flooded the market overall. This graph, what this shows is the amount of people, deaths over here, over time, from the year 2000 to 2015. If you look how many people are dying from all opioids, both illegal, synthetic, prescriptions, all over. There's a huge spike right around this. What you would need to pay attention to is those synthetic versions. Also, there was a huge spike in the death rates from fentanyl and carfentanil. I'll explain why. Heroin mixed with fentanyl and carfentanil is the leading cause of what's happening here. Why there's been a huge upswing of people dying of these overdoses. And I'll have a much better understanding of that in a little bit. What this map represents, the dark blue represents that these states are statistically higher in overall deaths from overdoses and so forth. And if you look at the light blue, means that they're statistically the same. The green, that they're nationally statistically lower than the other states. In Michigan, we are In Michigan, we are ranked 15th in the nation in overall overdose deaths. Ohio, just below us, a land bordering state, is ranked 4th in the nation. So it is a problem we've been drastically increasing, but I give credit to Governor Schneider and his entire team. He put together a task force a few years ago that to really help evaluate what is happening. This task force came into play even before the President of the United States started to look at this. President Trump recently, and congratulations and great job to President Trump for putting together his task force as well to look at this closely to see what we can do. President Trump recently declared this not a national emergency, but a public health crisis. And I truly believe that this is a public health crisis, but we have some work to do. I truly believe the states in green have put together certain laws and education programs that really help keep their patients and the people in their states safe. And I think that we are on the right track in Michigan. I think that, again, Governor Schneider has done a fantastic job of really tackling this. What this shows is an overall map of the state of Michigan. And if you look, the darker the color, the more deaths per 10,000 residents. And there's the key point with this is there's not one city, there's not one county that is immune to the opioid epidemic. In southeastern Michigan, just because of the sheer number of people that have died of overdoses, the sheer number of people that there are, it's a concentrated area in Michigan of Oakland, Wayne, and Macomb County. Those are probably, in terms of number, the highest number. But if you look at per 10,000 people, it is all over. If you were to take the same type of map of every state in the United States, you would see a similar breakdown because of the fact there's not one county, city, or state in the matter that's truly immune from this opioid epidemic. We cannot ignore the fact that 6 out of 10 drug overdose deaths in Michigan involve opioid drugs, both prescription and heroin. Nationwide, 52,000 people. We talked about this. Is why I'm so passionate about this, that from overdoses in general, all drugs, at a rate of 2015, 52,000 surpassed car accidents and it surpassed gun violence. 63% of those overdoses involve an opioid. The top 4 states in overdoses, overall drug overdoses, have been West Virginia, have been New Hampshire, Kentucky, and our land bordering Ohio is number 4 in the nation. We're number 15, but we're rising. And I think we're taking appropriate action. We're taking appropriate action around education and so forth to help slow this down. What's interesting is people aged 45 to 54 had the highest rate and increase in overall death rates. So what are some of the signs of dependence? We talked about tolerance. Someone's needing more and more to get the same effect. They go down this path where their brain chemistry has changed. That's why I keep repeating that it takes a lot of effort, a lot of time to help people, and a lot of different approaches. There's not just one approach. Everybody's different to help people get healthy. Withdrawal symptoms. If you take away the drug, their brain has changed. So guess what? Their brain's saying, what the heck, where's the drug? It sets off a series of horrible, really hard reactions on the body. And that's why people relapse so often. People end up taking larger amounts over time to get that same effect. They start craving the drug. They're persistently wanting to quit, but they can't. They're spending a lot of time and effort trying to obtain the drug. They're missing work. They're missing family events. They're giving up activities, continuing to use opioids. And they know that they're in danger, but they continue to use because of the fact they can't stop. They're failing to fill major obligations, as I mentioned, both at school and at work. They're putting themselves in tough situations, hazardous situations, just to obtain the drug, and continuing to use despite social reactions. So what other things can happen? There's a lot of drowsiness involved, a change in sleep habits, a lack of hygiene. I'm not saying that this happens with everybody, but they just don't look the same as they did before. They're not taking care of themselves. They have frequent flu-like symptoms. They're feeling sick. They have nausea. They're vomiting. Weight loss. You often see this. If you compare pictures of two people over a history that have been addicted to these type of drugs, you see drastic changes in their physical appearance through weight loss and because of lack of hygiene. They change in energy level, decreased libido because of the decreased levels of testosterone that gets impacted. Reappearance of old habits. People that stop smoking for years or stop drinking for years, all of a sudden it starts happening again as they're trying to cope with it. Loss of relationships. They're starting to become isolated. They're starting to hang around a different group of people for some reason. They start anxiously looking at their phone, looking for text messages or someone to return their text message. They start to steal. This is one of the hallmark signs of that. They start to steal because the average heroin addict, there's different reports out there, spends anywhere from $80 to $250 per day to maintain their habit. How do you maintain that? They start overspending. They start changes in work habits, exercise habits. They start missing work. They start missing social events. But the most telling sign is it is very important to not ignore these signs. They're in front of us. And a lot of times we just pretend that they're not there. When you notice that their company has changed, that's very crucial. They start hanging around a whole different group of people. That's why having those great relationships with family and friends and knowing who they're around is a key point. When you start noticing missing money or catch them lying about their activities, they say they were a certain place, but they never were. Lack of interest in work, studies, and school, and other activities. They oftentimes, I'm not saying this happens with everybody, but they become a whole new individual. But yet, we as their caring family and friends don't notice these changes. We're too blind to it. They're trying unnecessarily to hide parts of the body. They're wearing sweatshirts and so forth because they want to hide marks on their arm from injecting. When you notice that they don't care about their hygiene anymore. So from a health professional, we often see doctor shopping. They'll go from one doctor to another because they're getting desperate. They want to obtain these drugs. They'll go to a doctor saying they have back pain. Then they'll go to a dentist saying that they have toothaches. We often see that. They're going from one place to another. Multiple doctors are involved. Multiple pharmacies. You see them driving long distances. They'll drive by 30 pharmacies to come to your pharmacy. Well, guess what? You ask the question, well, you drove an hour away. Why are you here? And I understand that there's situations where there's local doctor and so forth that are nearby a pharmacy, but that's a very telling sign when they're driving all over the place. Odd behavior with health professionals. You see these people act in certain ways that you start questioning. They're acting very nervous. They act aggressive at times to try to obtain these drugs. Illegal prescriptions. You see them stealing prescription pads and writing out their own prescriptions. And remember that combination, it's not just the opioids that we see the lack of education around. The problem that I've seen, the evolution over the past 20 years, is when these type of drugs are combined with benzodiazepines such as Xanax, Valium, Ativan, and then also they're used with Soma, a muscle relaxer, and then promethazine with codeine. Those are all telling signs that you really got to pay close attention because they're at high risk from being injured. Let's talk a little bit about heroin and the evolution of that huge spike of deaths. It is because of heroin, people have gone from prescription drugs, 75 to 80% have gone into heroin. Then heroin, the problem is this, is that heroin is potent within itself, but when it's laced with fentanyl, which is 50 to 100 times more potent, and then or carfentanil, which is even more potent than that. Carfentanil is a drug that's not used in humans. It's an elephant tranquilizer, and a speck of it, a little speck of it, can cause a person to go into overdose. We'll talk about that. Heroin is a solid, is sold and used in a number of different forms: white or brown powder, black sticky substance, and sold in black chunks. Now, here's the thing that people don't realize about heroin: that it could be smoked, it could be snorted, or injected. A lot of times people like the injected version versus the smoked, and that's why sometimes it's referred to as chasing the dragon. When they burn a spoon and that cloud of dust comes up, or cloud of smoke, it looks like it's a dragon. You're chasing the dragon. So what happens is that they like the injection version because of the fact that it goes right into the bloodstream. It goes right into that and gives that intense high because it goes to those receptors in the brain right away at a very high level. I'm going to show you a 1-minute video that shows the history of how heroin is made. You're going to find this very interesting about why we are in the problem.
7 tons of heroin were seized in the United States last year alone. That's nearly 15,000 pounds of hard narcotics. This is how it gets here. Nearly all heroin destined for America comes from drug cartels in Mexico and Colombia. It starts with the seed of an opium poppy, planted, then harvested 3 months later. The seed pods are sliced, releasing a milky fluid that turns dark and sticky. This is raw opium in its simplest form. Once extracted, it's taken to labs, where the opium is mixed with hot water to release the key ingredient, morphine. Various chemicals are added, and after several days, the clay-like morphine base is dried and turned into powdery heroin. Cartels smuggle heroin into the U.S. any way they can, but most often getting it through U.S. border checkpoints. Traffickers disguise it, hide it, and bury it deep inside cars, trucks, and yes, even people. Interstate highways are a fast, effective network to move heroin across America to towns and cities. Drug syndicates like El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel have distributors and dealers in virtually every state. The spread of heroin across America has surged in recent years, in part because heroin costs as little as $5 a hit. In 2014, there were more than 10,000 heroin-related deaths. That number is expected to go even higher because traffickers are now mixing heroin with an illegal synthetic form of the painkiller, fentanyl, which is 50 to 100 times more potent. The spread of heroin now a growing threat. This is the poisoning of America.
Hopefully that gave you a good understanding of where heroin is coming from. And also, the key point is when heroin is being mixed with fentanyl or carfentanil. So here's a graph, a picture that's going to just blow you away. What this represents is heroin, fentanyl, and carfentanil. So this amount of heroin is an overdose situation that someone can die from. The same amount of overdose drug that's needed in fentanyl is this amount. This equates to this amount of heroin in terms of an overdose situation. Here's the problem. When you mix fentanyl with heroin and somebody doesn't know it, these drug dealers don't care. They don't care about the purity of it. They want to give you as big a high as possible and make sure that they can smuggle it into the United States. The problem is, look how potent that is, 50 to 100 times stronger than this. Here's another thing that's just going to blow you away, carfentanil. That elephant tranquilizer, this speck right there represents the equivalent of this. So when this is mixed with this, it causes people to go into an overdose situation literally immediately. And there's two reasons why I see them doing this. Is one, when you're mixing carfentanil with heroin, you need a smaller amount of the drug to smuggle in the United States. It's easier. You don't need as big a powder. The quantities isn't as high. So it's much easier to smuggle into the United States, that's one. And two, it's easier to transport throughout the United States. The other thing is, remember that tolerance thing? Your brain is used to it. It wants more and more and more over time. So these cause people to get these extreme highs. But the problem is the lethal dose is so close that they don't know what they're taking. They don't know the potency of these drugs. So on a heroin addict, they may be taking pure heroin. They may be taking heroin mixed with fentanyl, carfentanil mixed with heroin. All dangerous situations. And that's why we've seen that huge spike in opioid deaths, is because of the fact that heroin is being laced with these type of drugs. So what are the physical signs of heroin abuse? We talked a little bit about this: slurred speech, sleepy eyes, photophobia, the pupils constrict, they get pinpoint pupils, they fall asleep anywhere, they get nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, they start to lose weight, track marks. I'll show you a picture in a second where they have little marks up and down their arm from injecting, or their legs. The pinpoint pupils we mentioned. This video, this 1 minute video, is going to show you the progression of somebody getting injured, somebody needing prescriptions, somebody going from prescription pain drugs, then moving on to heroin, and then finally onto death, because of the fact that is the progression that we're seeing today. Again, this is going to really open your eyes. Pay attention to some of those signs. It's a fast moving video, but just pay attention to the overall theme of what happens. hopefully that gave you a quick understanding of the progression. I know it's a dramatic video, but that is reality of what's happening in today's world. Some of the physical signs that we see out there, easily readable signs, those track marks that we look for. Remember that heroin can be snorted, it can be smoked, it can be injected, but you'll often see track marks on the arms or the legs. Addicts have slurred speech at times. They have pupils, the tiny pupils that I keep reinforcing. They have a tendency to fall asleep. They complain of nausea. The most obvious symptom is the fact that they refuse to eat anything. So a lot of these patients start to lose massive amounts of weight. So you'll see drug supplies as well. You'll see syringes, rubber tubes, spoons with burnt edges, residues of whitish or brownish powder, tiny bags. You'll see the track marks that I talked about. Heroin use is trending up because it costs a lot less than a lot of these other things that are out there versus some of these expensive prescription drugs. But the problem is that literally 3 out of 4 people that are addicted to heroin have at one point started with prescription drugs. The amount of drugs that are being seized throughout the United States has also increased, so there's a huge influx. The amount of people that have died from opioid deaths has gradually increased in the state of Michigan over time. And a lot of this is because of the fact that of the illegal drug that's being made in the labs that's being laced with heroin called fentanyl, as we talked about. So what can we do? We got to improve opioid prescribing. We got to educate the prescribers. I'm not saying this. I've heard reports that a lot of facilities now are saying, oh, we're not going to give opioids at all. That's not the right approach. There are legitimate people out there that are suffering from pain that need these drugs, cancer patients, but not at the rate that we're going now. If someone comes in for an acute injury, do we truly need to give them a humongous bottle of pain drugs? And guess what, where these drugs are, patients end up taking 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 tablets, and they're putting them in their medicine cabinet, and then other people can come and grab them. Granddaughters come over, grandsons, friends and family come and take them out of that cabinet, and they start using these type of drugs. Education is key around the prescribers. 75 to 80% of heroin addicted individuals started with prescription drugs. Increased accountability. There's a lot of people that are not practicing medicine or pharmacy in the proper way. And these type of people that are doing a lot of harm need to be held accountable. And I think we're doing a good job of that over time. A lot of these people are being called out, they're being monitored closely, and that's what's needed, that we cannot have people that are just causing pill mills to go out there where they're just giving out these prescriptions left and right without any type of accountability. We need to increase access to evidence-based substance abuse treatment, which we'll talk about. Expand access on Naloxone. Naloxone has been a huge win. And this all starts with the great strides that Governor Schneider has done with putting together a task force, putting together, trying to get to the root cause, trying to get to areas where we can really hit this epidemic in a great way. I'll explain to you, Naloxone is an antidote. If someone is in an overdose situation, you give them Naloxone, either a nasal version most of the time or an injection, and it reverses out the opioid overdose within minutes, allowing EMS to come to allow them to live. Promote prescription monitoring programs. In Michigan, we have something called MAPS, the Michigan Automated Prescription System. If a patient gets a controlled substance filled, it's uploaded to MAPS. So if they go to another doctor, a doctor can look up their MAPS profile and say, well, wait a second, you just went to the doctor down the street and you had this filled. Why are you coming to me today? Pharmacies also have access to MAPS. MAPS was one of the things that came out of Governor Schneider's task force as well to revamp it. And it has been revamped. It is much easier to use, it's much faster to use, and it's much better to use. There's no reason that these type of prescription monitoring programs are not used, because we can then get to the root cause of, hey, wait a second, you just had this filled at another pharmacy yesterday. Why are you bringing it here to me today? But the problem is this, there's been reports that only 40 to 50% of prescribers are using these prescription monitoring programs in Michigan. We need to get better at that. Another thing is that there's laws in place that are in works right now that if a prescriber meets with a patient that they've never seen before and they want to give opioid drugs, they have to run MAPS first. That's a huge win. Implement state strategies, which we're doing now, and improve the detection of illegal opioid use by working with state and local officials, and we're doing that. There's 3 guarantees that any opioid user long-term that's addicted to heroin or prescription painkillers, they're at high risk for one of these 3 things. They're at high risk for overdosing, they're at high risk for going to jail, or they're at high risk for dying. Plain and simple, we have to understand that. They are high risk. Let's not sugarcoat it. These individuals are high risk for one of these 3 things, of overdosing, of going to jail, or dying. Make other family members aware, family and friends. This is crucial as well. And here's why. Because the more people of support network, it takes a lot of people and a lot of support to help get these people clean. Make people aware that they're suffering from this. And by the way, they can also have naloxone around them, and I'll tell you why that's important. They can have naloxone on hand in case these individuals go into overdose situation. Seek outside support from health professionals. There's nothing wrong with talking to your doctor and going to your doctor and saying, what can I do to get help? Do not give an addict money. Do not enable them. By giving them money, you're enabling them for their addiction to get worse. And we can do something about that. We can change that over time. Do not overly criticize. Criticism doesn't do anything to help with the situation. These people need compassion, they need understanding, and they need as much support as possible. That's why it takes a whole group effort to help these individuals. Educate yourself. Some of the most successful people of children that have gotten over these addictions, their parents themselves, have educated themselves, have gone on Google and started to read and ask questions, talk to health professionals about what they can do. Take it within yourself. Don't wait for people to help you. If you wait, then you're wasting crucial time. But educate yourself and doing as much research as you can about the history of it, what you can do, the warning signs, and what you can do going forward. A drug problem is a medical issue. That change in brain chemistry, this is an issue. This is a medical issue that takes a lot of different approaches. Everybody's different. Some people are more prone to addiction than others. I believe there's also a genetic link. But the problem is that we can't cookie cutter an approach for all these individuals. So every addict, they suffer in health. They can have serious health issues. Their relationships suffer. Their work and career can suffer. Their schoolwork suffers. Legal situation suffers, and obviously their finances. And then also just the people around them, their family and friends, suffer at great lengths. So how do you get help? Educate yourself. Seek medical attention. Medical attention. Go to your doctor that can then refer you to a clinical psychologist, a psychiatrist. A medical doctor then can defer you to somebody that specializes in addiction. They then can start the conversation around the healing process. What do we need to do? Put together a plan, an aggressive plan with family support and group support, the medical professional support. There's actually drug treatments that we can use as well. There's a lot of different things. There's medication-assisted treatment that can be used to help people slowly get off of this addiction, to slowly change the brain back to a healthy level where it doesn't need these drugs. Methadone is one of them. Buprenorphine is a drug that's mixed with naltrexone, and I'll explain to you why that's so important. Because of the fact that drugs such as Suboxone are a drug that is used to help people slowly get off of the opioid addiction. What this drug is, this component of Suboxone, it's a partial agonist, meaning that it attaches to the receptor, still giving people what they need, of what their brain needs in terms of that neurotransmitter release, but it also contains naltrexone, which is an antagonist, which blocks those receptors as well. So in essence, it's slowly changing the brain. Now, listen, I've heard a lot of people say that they've also had issues long-term with getting off of Suboxone, but still, this is where close medical supervision comes into play. In addition to those, talk therapy, I think, has to be used in terms of helping people, whether it be one-on-one talk through a psychologist or a psychiatrist or group therapy. That is crucial. When combining these methods of medical help, of getting talk therapy, group therapy, support from family and friends, it could take 1 to 2 years for someone to become totally clean and away from that craving for these type of drugs. Ongoing counseling is crucial. Treatment requires aftercare. One of the problems is that a lot of these people, they go into relapse because of the fact that they're craving these drugs still. Their brain still has not healed. It requires ongoing counseling and support from a lot of different people. This is a busy slide. I don't want you paying attention to all the busyness of it, but there are drugs available. Drugs like Suboxone. There's different versions of Suboxone that are available. Same drug, same 2 active ingredients, but just in different dosage forms. There's actually a drug called Probufine that's an implant in the forearm that gives that type of drug slowly released so that they help with the cravings. These drugs attach to those same receptors in the brain to allow the receptor to still be triggered to an extent. But the difference between Suboxone and these drugs is that historically with opioids, if you take more and more, you over time, you develop tolerance. You need to keep taking more. Suboxone starts to level off after a certain dose that if you keep taking more of it, you're not going to get that increased response. Also, there's new drugs that are being looked at in terms of helping with the withdrawal symptoms. There's a drug that is used in the United Kingdom called Britlofex, which is a drug like clonidine here in Michigan or in the United States in general that can help with the withdrawal symptoms that you go through and so forth. Methadone has historically been used in methadone clinics because it is a long-acting opioid. And then naltrexone. I'm not a big fan of naltrexone by itself because of the fact that when someone takes an antagonist by itself long-term, if they're actively using still, it could literally set them into withdrawal almost immediately. But these are different options that are available on the market. Different options. So I think it requires family support, intense family and friend support. It requires possible treatment of medications that are available. It requires counseling and it requires aftercare. Educate yourself on what is needed. Certain things that we can do today. There's a lot of insurance companies now that are limiting acute prescriptions. Instead of allowing a doctor to give 120 tablets, a 30-day supply for acute injuries, they're limiting them to 7-day supply. I think that's a start. I think it begins the conversation. Annual prescriber training. I think this is a huge miss over the past 20 years. Prescribers just are not trained enough on pain management. And I'm not just talking about opioids, I'm talking about pain management in general. There's new drugs that are in the pipeline. I think President Trump's committee that he has put together with Chris Christie leading the opioid task force have really worked with a lot of people to get new drugs out there that are not addictive, that are not opioids. Prescription monitoring programs that we talked about, these have to be used. They're there in Michigan right now too, but I just think they're underutilized. And I think that that's where we're going to really start ramping up in terms of overall, in terms of what's going to happen, because of the fact that we want to encourage providers to use the information that's there. MAPS is a great tool to help detect some of the abuse that's going on out there. Also, that's not on here is prescription take-back days. You can literally go back to any state police department or law enforcement office. You can do the research on your own, call your local law enforcement. They'll take back unused medications from you, usually Monday through Friday. You can just take them back, no questions asked, and they'll properly dispose of these drugs for you. The problem with these drugs is people don't know how to dispose them. We don't want them getting into the water supply either. So there's a lot of information that you can go to at fda.gov, DEA.gov, and really do the research on your own. There's how to dispose of these type of drugs safely. You don't want them sitting in your medicine cabinet. But recently there was National Take-Back Days. The DEA put together these take-back days where you encourage people on a Saturday to go for a 4-hour period that you can drop off these unused prescription drugs to get them out of your home at no questions asked. So the drug treatment we've already talked about. Naloxone standing order. This is something that I'm so thankful for. I think the governor did an amazing job with this. Credit goes to the whole task force that put this together. There were so many people involved. Naloxone is an antidote pretty much. It's an antagonist. When someone is on an active overdose and they stop breathing, you can literally give this drug through a nasal version or an injection version and it can reverse that out. The great part about it is now this through a standing order, anybody, if you're a family, a friend, somebody that you know of that's at high risk for opioid overdose, you can actually request it by going to a pharmacy counter if the pharmacist is trained, and they can actually make sure they're counseling the patient, they give the documents to the person that they're giving it to. You can obtain this without a prescription, kind of like a flu shot. And if you have a loved one that is at high risk, I highly encourage you to have naloxone around. The problem, some people have a hard time affording it. Some insurances don't cover it. It can range anywhere from $100 to $250. But if you have a loved one that you truly care about, that's an investment that you got to consider. Well, the way it works is that when an opioid is attached, say someone uses heroin or a prescription painkiller in an excess and they're in an overdose situation, what naloxone does is it comes and knocks the drugs off those receptors, allowing the person to be able to breathe, allowing EMS to be able to arrive. It also blocks the receptor, stopping from more drug attaching. The problem is this, is that with these potent drugs that heroin is being mixed with, fentanyl and carfentanil, because of the fact they're so strong, naloxone is not able to knock them off the receptor. So it's taking multiple doses of naloxone, sometimes 5 to 9 doses of naloxone to get somebody out of an overdose situation. There's a couple different forms of it that's available. Narcan, which is a nasal version, and there's also an injection version, kind of like an EpiPen. There's something called Evzio, which actually, once you open it, it actually starts talking to you. The actual drug, the container starts talking to you step by step on what to do. So educate yourself. If a pharmacist is registered, they're trained, and they can stock it, they can give it to you without a prescription through that standing order. There's a sheet that's developed by the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, that shows you a step-by-step on how to use the nasal version and where to inject if someone is in an overdose situation for the injection version. There's a step-by-step sheet also at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, what to do in an overdose situation. Identify if someone is in an overdose, especially if you know they're at high risk. Call 911. Open the airway. Remember, the main pathway that people die from these overdoses is they stop breathing. They're not getting oxygen to the brain. No CPR. I highly suggest, if you know that that's another thing that you can do, is no CPR in case somebody needs it. Give naloxone. Usually within a few minutes, they can get to a point where they can start breathing again, allowing EMS to come. But the problem is that if after 2 to 3 minutes, if you don't get a response, you may have to give another dose of naloxone. Put them in this recovery position after they start breathing to allow them to continue breathing until EMS arrives and so forth, so that they can help. This was a quick overview. I hope you really enjoyed the presentation. It's something I'm passionate about. This is a man-made epidemic. There's certain things that we can do. I think that our state government has done a fantastic job of really putting this to the forefront. I think that President Trump has done a good job of really putting this to the forefront. Now it is really up to us to continue making sure that we do all we can to curb this horrible epidemic. Thank you so much.